In a world where your app is competing with millions of others, it's important for it to stand out visually as much as functionally. Sprinkling some beautiful animations across your app can really enhance its appeal and the user's overall experience. SVGs are incredibly versatile, customizable, and can be animated inside of your apps for a unique effect. Rive, formerly known as Flare, is an animation software that can be used to easily create animated SVGs. The Rive Flutter package can then be used to seamlessly add the animations you create into your apps. Hello everyone, my name is Ashley and welcome to ResoCoder. Our goal here is to provide top-level education and teach you the skills needed to become an in-demand Flutter developer. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss a single video. Let's get started! In this tutorial, before we do any coding, we're going to learn how to use the essential features of the Rive editor. After this section, you should feel confident enough to start creating your very own animations. Then, we're going to use pre-created animated SVGs to create a UI-only music player app. Let's take a look at the finished app now. When we run the app, the first thing we're going to see will be a splash screen with a dancing radio. After 3 seconds, we'll be taken to the music player page. Here, we have an image of an album cover and a music player control interface. Here, we have 2 buttons for going to the next and the previous tracks. When we tap these buttons, they will display a one-shot animation. Next, we have this play-pause button in the center. When the button is pressed from the pause state, we're going to see the following animation. Then, when we press the button again from the playing state, we'll see this animation. The play-pause button is very interesting because it actually has multiple animations which play based on certain conditions. This is achieved using a state machine in Rive, and it is something we'll be covering in this tutorial. Lastly, you may have noticed that when we press the play-pause button, it also plays and pauses the sound wave animation at the bottom. And be sure to check out the written tutorial from the link in the description, where you can also find all the code written in this video and go through this tutorial at your own pace. For this tutorial, we'll be using a very simple starter project. All this project has are 2 pages and some assets. In our lib folder, we only have 3 files: main.dart, music player, page.dart, and splash screen.dart. Our main.dart file has an app widget, which returns a material app, and the material app has the splash screen and its home parameter. Splash screen is just a stateful widget that returns a scaffold with a background color of yellow. And I'm just going to swap out the splash screen here for the music player page so we can see it. And there we go. So the music player page is also a stateful widget, which has a scaffold, a centered column, and inside the column we've got this container, which displays an image of an album cover to go with our music player theme. These files we just looked at don't really have much in them, and that's because the majority of this app will be built using animated elements. This is where the assets folder comes in. Here, we have the image we used for the album cover, but more importantly, here's where we have all of the Rive files we will be using. It would take a bit too long if we were to create these files during this tutorial, so we pre-made them for you. To create these files, we used regular SVGs that were imported and animated inside the Rive editor. When we're inside the editor, I will show you how you can inspect and play around with these asset files on your own. As I mentioned previously, before we do any coding, we'll learn how to use the Rive editor. But before we get into that, let's add the Rive dependency to our project so we don't forget to do that later on. Let's go to our pubspec.yaml. And here we're going to add Rive. And we're using the most current version at the time. Version is 0.7.28. Save that. And now let's learn how to create some animations. If you don't already have a Rive account, you'll need to go ahead and create one now. To do that, go to rive.app and click Launch or Login. You will then be taken to the login registration page, and here you can create your account. Feel free to pause this video now and come back to it when you're logged in and are seeing this home dashboard. Now that you're all set up, you should be seeing this page here. Here, you can see all of your work, create new folders, and create new files. If you're working in a team, Rive also offers a collaboration feature. While all of the features we'll be using today are free, to be able to create teams, you would need a paid subscription. So, first, let's go ahead and create a new file like this. When you create a new file, you'll be asked to create an artboard. An artboard is like a canvas where you'll be creating your animations and graphics. We're going to leave the default dimensions here, so just go ahead and click Create. When you click Create, you'll be taken to the design mode of the editor. In design mode, you can create your own graphics or import SVGs created in other softwares like Adobe Illustrator. You can then edit whatever you create or import here. Also, in Rive, your work is saved automatically, so you never have to worry about remembering to save your files. In the top bar of the editor, you can click on this plus icon over here, and here you can do things like add shapes, create paths using the pen tool, create additional artboards, bones, and groups. Let's add a star to our artboard, so let's go to the shape menu and add a star here. Now click on the artboard and drag out the star until you've reached its desired size. We want our star to have dimensions of 200 by 200, so we're going to select it and then go over to the sidebar over here and change its dimensions in the size settings. So let's change the width to 200 and the height to 200. Perfect. When the star is selected, you can see these arrows pointing to the X and the Y axis, the circle over here, and the box surrounding the shape. You can use the portion of the arrows past these little squares to change the shape's position, and the portion of the arrows behind these little boxes or these little squares to change the shape's scale values. You can use the circle to change the rotation value. And if you pull on the box sides or corners, the shape scale value and the position values will change. If you are interested in more precise editing though, you will likely favor using this right sidebar to change these values. Let's revert back to our original values over here, and that should be good. Now let's give our star a little bit of style. Let's make it yellow by giving it a fill color of FFC000. Press enter. Perfect. And let's give it a stroke of color black with a thickness of 4. Perfect. We're going to limit our designing to this, but there's really a lot more you can do. Now let's center the star in the middle of the artboard and also zoom out just a bit. Now let's head over to the Animate Mode. And when you switch to Animate Mode, everything stays pretty much the same. The main difference is that this timeline that appears at the bottom over here. Now in this mode, you can create one or more animations by changing the properties of the shapes and layers and adding keyframes to the timeline for the changes that you make. Let's create our very first animation. Double click on the existing animation over here. And let's rename it to rotation. It's very important to name your animations thoughtfully and strategically, because the names you add here will be used inside your Flutter project to add the animations into your app. Now let's make our star rotate from 0 to 360 degrees. To do this, select the star and make sure the playhead is at the beginning of the timeline. You can see here the rotation setting is set to 0 degrees, so all we're going to do is click on this rhombus over here and that adds a keyframe to the beginning of our timeline. You have now created a starting point for your animation. Next, move the playhead over to the end of the timeline and change the rotation to 360 degrees. Press enter, and that adds a second keyframe to the end of our timeline, which will represent the end point of the animation. So when this animation plays, it will transition from 0 degrees to 360 degrees within the animation duration. You can change the duration and playback speed by clicking on this time over here. We're going to leave it as is. Now let's see our animation in action. To quickly go back to the beginning of the timeline, you can click this button over here and then click play to see the animation. Awesome. The animation plays only once because it's set to be a one-shot animation. You can also change this to a looping or a ping pong animation over here. Now let's create one more animation. The next animation we're going to create will shrink and grow our star. So let's add an animation like this and rename it to scale. Make sure this animation is selected and also select the star. Make sure the playhead is at the beginning of the timeline. And now go ahead and click on this rhombus next to the X and this rhombus next to the Y-axis of the scale setting. This will ensure that our star is initially at 100% scale. Next, move the playhead over to 30 frames point in our timeline and change the X and the Y-axis to 50%. Press enter and change this to 50 and press enter again. Great. We're going to add one more keyframe to the end point of our timeline. So let's move the playhead over. And here at the end, we want the star to grow back to its original size. So we want to set the scale values back to 100%. We can do it like we did previously by changing them in the sidebar over here. Or since we already have a keyframe with the same values at the very beginning, we can just copy it and paste it in the end like so. So you can select the keyframe, copy it, and then add it right here to the end of the timeline. Now let's bring the playhead back to the beginning and see how everything looks. Awesome. Great job. Next, we're going to get into state machines in Rive. Let's add a state machine to our project and then discuss what state machines are all about. So let's hit this plus icon and add a state machine. Let's rename it to Star Animation. Now, naming your state machines is just as important as naming your animations thoughtfully, because you will also be using this name you create here inside of your Flutter project. So, state machines provide a way to visually connect your animations. The animations you add to a state machine will be considered states. You can define certain conditions and trigger transitions from one animation or state to another based on the given conditions. This can really enhance your animations and give you great control over them inside of your app. Now let's take a look inside of the state machine panel. And here you can see 3 states: entry, any state, and exit. Transitions from the entry state define which animation should play first. Transitions from the any state will play the animation regardless of which state is currently active, as long as the conditions on the transition are met. And transitions to the exit state will exit the state machine. The more you experiment with Rive and state machines, using these states and connecting your animations will become increasingly more intuitive. First, let's create some simple transitions for our animations inside of the state machine. Click on the scale and rotation animations and drag them into the state machine panel. Then arrange them in the following order. First, let's move these two out of the way, and then place the rotation over here and the scale over here. When you hover over a specific state or animation, you're going to see this dot appear. Now just click and drag to the state you want to transition to. We want to transition from the entry state to the rotation state. When you see the rotation state turn blue, you can release the mouse. You have now created a forward transition from the entry state to the rotation animation state. You can now click this play button over here and see the transition in action. Awesome. You can then hit pause to reset the state machine. Now let's add one more transition from the rotation state to the scale state. And if you hit play now, you're only going to see the scale animation. That's because the exit time for the transition from the rotation to scale is set to 0, meaning that we don't actually let the rotation animation play out. To fix this, we can select the transition from the rotation to scale state, represented by this arrow. And then we can enable the exit time setting and set this to 1000 milliseconds, which is the time it takes for the rotation animation to play in full. Now hit play, or actually reset the state machine from our previous play, and hit play again, and you will see both transitions play out. Now let's learn about inputs and conditions. If you look over here to the left of the state machine panel, you will see that we can add some inputs. We're going to use these inputs to create conditions for our transitions. If you click on this plus icon over here, you can see that we can create a number, a Boolean, or a trigger input. First, let's create a number input. Let's rename it to level. And just like animations and state machines, your input naming should be done thoughtfully because you will be using these names in your code. Now we can use this input to create our first condition. Select the transition from the entry to the rotation state. Then click this plus icon over here and select the name of our input from the drop-down menu. Here, we can set the value for the condition and specify whether we want it to be equal to, less than, greater than, etc. than this value. We're going to leave it as equals to, and we're going to change this from 0 to 2. Awesome. Now let's do the same thing for the rotation to scale transition. But here we're going to change it to 4. We're all done setting up our conditions, so let's hit play. As you can see, the animations aren't playing. That is because the value next to our input name, over here, is set to 0. You can change this value to test your conditions. So let's change it from 0 to 2. And now we see the first transition. When we change it again to 4, we see the second transition. Amazing. Later on, we'll learn how to initiate animations based on these kinds of conditions inside our code. And we won't be using the number input in our project, but if you want to try it in your own project, you could use it in combination with something like an in-app slider. Now let's add a Boolean input and rename it to switch. This input is named very accurately because it can only have two possible values, true or false. It's represented by this checkbox over here in the input panel. So when it's unchecked, it's set to false, and when it's checked, it's set to true. Now let's select the entry to rotation transition and delete this level condition and add a switch one instead. We're going to leave it set to true. So now rotation animation will play only when the switch input has a value of true. So let's press play and then check this box over here. There you go. And we also see the second animation or the second transition play because this requires the level to be set to 4, and here it still is. So to give you an example, you can use this Boolean input to create things like animated toggles in your app. But really, the only limit to what you can create with all of this is set by your own imagination. The final input we're going to create will be a trigger input. So let's add one now and rename it to tap. The trigger input is also technically a Boolean because it can only have a true or a false value. But the difference is that this input can be set to true, but then it is immediately reset to false. So it behaves kind of like a button. And it is accurately represented here by this kind of a radio button. When we click on it, you can see a white dot briefly appear and then disappear. That is the visual representation of the value being set to true and then immediately being reset to false. Now let's add a condition using this input. Select the rotation to scale transition, and then let's delete this level condition and add a tap 1 instead. Now we can tap on that button next to the input name and it will trigger the transition. So let's hit play and then tap this button, and there you go. Lastly, if you want to download your animations and use the file in your Flutter app, all you need to do is click this button over here, then download, and then select for newest runtime. Amazing! We are now all done with the Rive Editor basics. This by no means covers all of the features of this feature-rich editor, but you should now have enough knowledge to start creating your own animations and also understand the animations we will be using inside of our Flutter project. If you want to inspect the Rive files included in the starter project, all you need to do is create a new file in Rive and then drag the file you want to play around with into the editor. Now, let's finally get to the coding portion of this tutorial. There are multiple ways to add Rive animations into your Flutter projects. We're going to be looking at several so that you know exactly what to do no matter what your use case is. First, let's add the simplest possible animation, which doesn't require us to control any aspects of it. Let's head over to the splash screen.dart file, and here we're going to add a container to the body parameter of the scaffold. We're going to give this container a width of 400. And as a child, we're going to provide our animation. We're going to do that by using Rive animation.asset constructor. And we're also going to import the Rive package here now. So as the first positional parameter of this constructor, we're going to provide the path to where our animation file is located in our assets folder. If you wanted to provide a file through the network, you could also do that by using the .network constructor. So let's provide our path now. It's going to be assets/radio/animation.riv. Great. And let's also center this container with a center widget. And let's give this a save. Awesome. Now you see this looping animation of a dancing radio with floating musical notes. Yes, it really is that simple. Now, before we move on to the next page in our app, let's make the splash screen a little bit more realistic. We don't really have much to load in this app, so let's just simulate the loading time by delaying the navigation to our music player page. So let's go over here and create an init state or override the init state. Delete this. And here we're going to say future.delayed. And we're going to give it a duration of 3 seconds. And here we're going to say navigator dot push replacement I'm going to leave the context as is and provide a material page route. Oops. Let's give this a save so it's not so messy. And here we're going to return our music player page. Excellent. Let's add some commas so this isn't a big mess. And now we can take a look at everything. So yeah, we're literally just delaying the navigation to the music player page. That is all. It is definitely not something you should be doing, and a splash screen should be used if you actually have a lot of stuff to load in your app. But this is how we're going to do it just for visual purposes only. So let's give this a save and actually restart our app. And 3 seconds should pass. And there you go. We are taken to the next page in our app. Next, we're going to add a couple of one-shot animations. Head on over to the music player page.dart. And here we only have an image of an album cover right now. So let's start adding some animated player controls. Since we're only focusing on animations in this tutorial, the only functionality of these controls will be to display the animations. But you could definitely tie in a real music player to the setup. First, we're going to add 2 buttons for going to the next and previous track. When we tap on these buttons, the animation will play once per tap. First, we need to add 2 controllers, one for each button. So let's go ahead and over here in the music player page state, right above the build method, we're going to add 2 late variables for these controllers. It's going to be of type Rive Animation Controller. And the first one we're going to call Prev Button Controller. And also let's import the Rive package. And the second one also going to be late. It's going to be Rive Animation Controller again. And this one we're going to call Next Button Controller. We are marking these as late because we'll be initializing them inside of init state. And that is because we want them to be initialized only once our page widget is ready. Now let's initialize these variables inside of init state. So we're going to say init state, delete this. And here we're going to initialize the Prev Button Controller first. Now there's more than one class you can use to create a controller depending on what kind of animation you're displaying. For these, we're going to use one-shot animation class. If you notice though, our variable over here is of type Rive Animation Controller. And here we're using the one-shot animation class to create the controller object. We can do that because the one-shot animation class, if you take a look, extends the simple animation class, and the simple animation class extends the Rive Animation Controller. So due to this inheritance, we're able to use the one-shot animation and the simple animation classes to initialize a variable that is of type Rive Animation Controller. Now let's go back and continue initializing our controller variables. So remember we talked about the importance of naming your animations thoughtfully inside of the Rive editor? Well, this is where this comes into play. As a first positional parameter of the one-shot animation constructor, we need to provide the name of the animation that it will control. So for this previous button, our animation is named on Prev. And we're also going to say the autoplay parameter to false, because we don't want the animation to play on page load and only want it to play when we press the previous track button. Now let's initialize the next controller as well. So this one is called Next Button Controller, and it's also going to be a one-shot animation. Here our animation is called on next. And we're also going to say the autoplay parameter to false. Let's add a semicolon over here. So even though we're not using it here, you can define functions that will run at the start and at the end of these animations using the onStop and onStart parameters of the one-shot animation constructor. Now we've completed our controller setup, so let's go ahead and add the animations into our page. Let's head down to where we have our column, and then below this container, let's add a sized box for spacing. Let's give it a height of 60. And then below the sized box, we're going to add a row. Give this row a main axis alignment of main axis alignment dot center. And to this row, we're going to be providing our player controls. So let's say children. And then here we're going to be adding some gesture detectors because we want to be able to interact with these elements we're going to add. So let's add the first one now. And we will be specifying the on tap down function later. So for now though, let's add an empty function here just as a placeholder. And then below this, as a child of the gesture detector, we're going to add a sized box because that is how we're going to size our animated elements. For the sized box, we're going to give a height of 115 and a width of 115 as well. All right. And as a child of the sized box, we're going to use our familiar Rive animation.assets. And then here, like before, we're going to provide the path to our animation file. So for this one, it's going to be assets/prev track button.riv. And you can already see it appearing on the screen right now. Awesome. Now we want to be able to control this animation, so we need to provide our controller here. We're going to use the controllers parameter, and it takes in a list of controllers. We're just going to provide our one controller here. So it's going to be prev button controller, like so. Awesome. And now let's add the other button as well. It's going to be really similar to this other than the file name and the controller name. So we can just copy this over. And here change these prev to next, as well as this one. And you can see the second button is here as well. Now we have almost everything set up. We just want to be able to display the animation when the gesture detector is tapped. So let's define a separate function for that. So let's head up to where we define our variables, and then below them we can add our function. So it's going to return void, and we're going to call it play track change animation. We're going to use one function for both buttons. So we're going to need to pass in the controller which we want to work with. So we're going to say Rive animation controller, and we're going to call this parameter controller. All right. So now, first thing we want to do is check to make sure that the animation is not currently playing. We're going to do that by saying if controller.isActive equals false. So as long as it's not active, we're going to set it to active. So controller.isActive equals true. So now we can go ahead and call this function from inside our on tap down parameters of the gesture detectors. So let's delete this and then call this function here play track change animation, and actually jump down a little bit. We'll come back to this one in a sec. But here we're going to pass in the controller for this animated element, which is going to be the next button controller. And then we'll do the same thing for the one above. So here we're going to call this function again, play track change animation. And here we're going to pass in this preview button controller. Awesome. Now you can save this and hot reload the app. And let's see this in action. Actually, let's restart the app. And now when we click on the previous track button, you can see it's animated. And the next track button does the exact same thing. Amazing, this is working flawlessly. Now we're going to really take things up a notch by adding the most complex animation of this tutorial, one that uses a state machine. We are now going to work on adding the play pause button to our music player. The animation we created for this uses a state machine to combine two separate animations. As you can see, we're inside the Rive editor now, because before we add this element to our project, we're going to take a look at how the state machine is set up to have a better understanding of it. Here we can see that we have two animations, on play and on pause, and one state machine. Inside the state machine, we have one Boolean input is playing. When the animation loads, it will be in the entry state, not playing any animations and just displaying the play symbol on this button over here. When we set the is playing input to true, we're going to see the on play animation play. That will then leave our state machine in the on play state, and the symbol now will be a pause symbol. From this state, we want to be able to pause our music player and display the on pause animation. So when we set the is playing input to false again from this point, we're going to see the on pause animation play out. Now here's something we haven't seen before. When we come to the end of the on pause animation, the button will be displaying the play symbol again. And from here, we want to be able to press play inside of our music player and see the on play animation again. Essentially, we want to be able to switch back and forth between the on play and on pause animations. This is why we have this arrow over here pointing back at the on play state. So in our simple Rive walkthrough in the very beginning, we only created forward transitions, but you can also create backward transitions, going from the current state, which here is the on pause state, to the previous state, which here would be the on play state. Let's reset the state machine and just kind of run this whole thing through once to have a good understanding of it. So let's press play, and you can see we're in the entry state. We set this to true. The on play animation plays. We set this to false. The on pause animation plays. And then when we set it to true again, the on play animation plays once more. And then if we set it to false one more time, the on pause animation plays. And we can keep doing this all day. Now that we know how this works and have a good understanding of it, let's add this animated button into our app. Adding a state machine animation into our app will require a series of steps and is quite different from what we did previously. So let's take this one step at a time. First, we need to load a Rive file for this animation in a form of byte data. So let's go up to our init state, and then after these controllers over here, we're going to say root bundle, and we need to import this root bundle from flutterservices.dart. And here we're going to say .load. To this load method, we're going to provide the path to our Rive file, which is going to be assets/play pause button.riv. And this load method returns a future with some byte data, which is what we need. So we're going to say .then. We're going to rename this value to data. And then we're going to change this to a block body because we're going to be doing a bunch of stuff in here. And the first thing we need to do is we need to create a Rive file object from this byte data. So we're going to do that and store it inside a final variable we're going to call file. And then you say Rive file dot import. And here, this expects us to pass in some byte data. So we're going to pass in this data object over here. Awesome. The next thing we need to do is locate the main artboard inside of this file over here and save it in its own variable. So let's do that. I'm going to say final artboard. And then we're going to say file.main artboard. So we're getting the main artboard from this file over here. Great. Now we need to create a controller for the state machine. So we're going to add that into a variable of its own, call it controller. And here we're going to say state machine controller dot from artboard. And let's just format this a little bit at least. Okay. And here we're actually, this was auto populated, but our variable is called artboard, so this works. So we need to pass in an artboard as the first parameter. And then here we need to pass in the name of our state machine. So in our Rive file, we call this state machine play pause button. So that works great. Format it and save it. Now for the next steps, we need to use this state machine controller that we just created. But it is possible for this controller variable to end up as null. This could happen if, for example, the name that we provided over here is incorrect, and therefore when this object is being created, it cannot find the matching state machine with that name. So for the next steps, first we need to check to make sure that this variable is not null. So let's do that using an if statement. So if controller does not equal to null, then we can add some code and do some stuff in here. Before we add anything in here though, we still need to do one more thing. We need to go outside of the init state and add two uninitialized variables. One for the Boolean input that we have in our state machine and one for the animations artboard. So let's do that. We can do that below these. So first one is going to be of type SMI input, and then you can also specify what kind of an input it's going to be. So ours is a value bool, and it could be nullable, so we're going to leave that as though, and we're going to call it play button input. Now let's create a variable for our artboard. It's going to be of type artboard. It's also going to be nullable, and we're going to call it play button artboard. Awesome. Now let's go back down to the if statement we just created over here. And the first thing we're going to do is we need to pass in this state machine controller into this artboard by saying artboard dot add controller, and then here we're going to pass in this controller like so. Then we can use the state machine controller, this one over here, to find the Boolean input we created in our Rive file and initialize the play button input we created over here with it. So let's do just that. So we're going to say play button input equals to controller, which is this controller over here, dot find input, and here we need to provide our input name. So we defined it as is playing. Amazing. We are almost done with this part. The last thing we need to do is initialize our play artboard, play button artboard variable over here. So let's see what we've done so far. We found the artboard inside of this Rive file we created. Then we loaded the artboard over here with the state machine controller. So now that our artboard is loaded with the controller, we can use setState and initialize the variable with this artboard. Okay, let's go down here. And then after this if statement, we're going to do just that. So we're going to say setState. And then we can make this into an arrow function and say play button artboard equals artboard. Amazing. That was quite a bit of work, but now we're good to go ahead and add the button into our widget tree. Before we can add the button, we need to account for one pesky little error. When the page initially loads, the build method will run before the play button artboard variable is initialized. If this isn't handled properly, it will cause an error notifying us that a null check operator was used on a null value. To prevent this from happening, we're going to do the following. Let's head down to where we have our size box and row, and in between we're going to use a ternary operator to say play button artboard. If it is equal to null, we're going to display a size box. And if it is not equal to null, we're going to display the rest of our UI. Amazing. Now we can finally add one more gesture detector to our row over here. So let's head down here. This is the first one. So these are the two buttons, these two buttons over here, and we want our play pause button to be in between them. So we're going to add a gesture detector right here then. Detector. And here we're going to give it a on tap down empty function for now, because we're going to create this function in a little while. And add a comma here. Awesome. Now as a child, we're once again going to add a size box of height 125 and width 125 because we want it to be a little bit bigger than our other two buttons. And here as a child of our size box, we're not going to add the Rive animation.asset anymore, and instead we're going to use a Rive widget. Here we're going to provide our artboard variable that we created. So play button artboard. And we're also going to give it a, oops. Oh, I see what's going on here. So we also need to add a bang operator here because we have already covered the possibility that this will be null. This is a nullable variable. So this was telling me that you cannot add a nullable variable in here, but since we already covered for that possibility, we know it won't be null when we reach this. So we can safely add this bang operator here. All right, cool. And now let's also give it a fit of box fit dot fit height. Amazing. Give this a save. And let's also give our app a restart so we can see everything properly. Amazing. Now you can see we've got 3 buttons over here and it is looking great. So next, we're gonna set up the logic for controlling this animation. So let's go up to the top and create a separate function for controlling this button animation. Let's go up above here and we can add it below this function. So this function is also going to return void, and we're gonna call it play pause button animation. We don't need to pass anything into this function. Now this animation depends on the state of our state machine input. So we're going to use the play button input variable to set up the logic here. So if the input value is false, and if the animation is currently not playing, we want to set the input value to true, which will then, if you remember, cause the onPlay animation to run. So let's set that up. Let's say if underscore play button input and it's nullable, so we're going to use the null safe operator. Dot value is equal to false, and play button input dot controller dot is active is equal to false. Then, oops, that was an unnecessary comma. All right, so if the value is set to false, and if the animation is currently not active, in that case, we want to set the input value to true. So we're going to say again, play button input dot value is equal to true. Amazing. And then if this ends up equating to false, then we're going to do a different check. So we're going to say else if play button input dot value is equal to true, and the play button input controller dot is active is equal to false. In this case, we want to set the play button input value to false. So if the input value is true and the animation is currently not playing, we want to set the input value to false. And this will cause the on pause animation to play. Amazing. So we're actually all set here. So let's add this function call to our gesture detector. So let's head down to over here. And now we can call that function from here. So play pause button animation. Great. Let's hot reload the app. And there you go, we press play. Now we're in the on play state, and then we can press pause. And now we're back to our previous animation, and we can just keep doing this. Awesome. Everything works just as intended. Now let's add the final animated element to this page. Since what we have here isn't a real music player and doesn't actually play music, we are instead going to add an animated element to represent this functionality. We're going to add a looping animation of a sound wave that will play and pause depending on the state of our play pause button. So first, let's create a late variable for this animations controller up at the top. We can create it right below these two controllers here. So late Rive animation controller, and we're going to call it sound wave controller. Now let's move over to init state and initialize this controller variable. So we're going to do that here. Sound wave controller. Now for this animation, we're going to use the simple animation class to create the controller object. We're not using the one-shot animation class because this animation plays in a loop. So let's do just that. We're going to say simple animation. And then here we're going to pass in the animation name, which is looping animation. And we're going to set the autoplay to false because we don't want it to play on page load, and add a semicolon here. Great. Now let's go and add the animated widget into our page. So let's scroll down. And then this is our final gesture detector. This is the row, and we're going to add it below this row over here. So first I'm going to add a sized box with a height of 40 for some spacing. Then below this size box, we're going to add a container. We're going to make it a height of 100 and width of 400. And now here, as a child, we're going to use our familiar Rive animation.asset and pass in the path to our animation file. So assets / soundwave.riv. We are going to give it a fit of box fit.contain. And we're going to pass in our controller to the controllers list. So it's going to be the sound wave controller over here. Amazing. And again, we need to restart the app here. And there you see it. So you see the element over here. And since the autoplay is set to false, nothing's happening. So next, let's set up the logic for activating and then pausing this animation. So let's head up to the top where we have all of the other functions that control our animations and add the one for the sound wave here as well. So it's going to return void. And essentially what we wanted to do is we wanted to toggle the active state back and forth for this animation. So we're going to call it toggle wave animation. And here we're going to use set state to toggle the is active property of the sound wave controller. So let's say set state. Actually, we can make that into an arrow function as well. And we're going to say sound wave controller dot is active equals to exclamation mark underscore sound wave controller dot is active. Great. Let's go back out of this a little bit. So as you can see here, this is just going to toggle whatever this is active property is equal to. Awesome. Now we want the playing and the pausing of the sound wave animation to align with the state of our play pause button. So we're going to call this function we just created from within the play pause button animation function. So let's do just that. This is that function right here. And when we toggle the input value, we also want to toggle our wave animation. So we're going to call this function here. And then over here, we want to do the same thing. Amazing. Now let's give it a save. So let's review what's happening here. When the page loads, the sound wave animation will not be active. Then when we press the play on the play pause button, it will activate the sound wave animation by toggling the is active property on its controller. Then when we press pause on the play pause button, it will toggle that property again, pausing the sound wave animation. So let's test all of this out right now. Let's give our app a restart. And here's our radio splash animation. And now everything is loaded here. So let's once again check these buttons. They're working great. And then let's press this play button. And as you can see, this animation runs and also this looping animation starts as well. So let's press pause. This animation happens and this animation is paused. Amazing. Congratulations. It's a wrap. All of our animations are fully implemented and functioning just as we want. You should now have enough knowledge to start creating and adding beautiful and practical animations into your apps. You should also have the fundamental knowledge required to keep growing and advancing your skills. To go through this tutorial at your own pace once again, and to get all of the code, check out the written tutorial available from the link in the description. And if you are serious about becoming a great Flutter developer who can build real apps for clients or at a job, go to flutter.education to get the top curated Flutter news and resources aimed at improving your app development career. Over there, you can also subscribe to the mailing list to get the best Flutter resources delivered weekly right into your inbox. And if you don't want to miss more tutorials like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel and join the notification squad by hitting the bell button to make sure you grow your Flutter skills, because here at ResoCoder, we are determined to provide you with the best tutorials and resources so that you will become an in-demand Flutter developer. Like the video if it helped you, leave a comment, and see you in the next one.